The 20th century was marked by dramatic upheavals, 2 world wars of great severity and destruction, and several economic crises. The interwar period, 1918 to 1939, ran from the end of the First World War to the beginning of the Second World War. During these years, 2 events stand out: the birth of the Soviet Union and the economic crisis of 1929. In this video, we will deal with the second of these events. The crisis erupted in October 1929 with the collapse of the New York Stock Exchange. The Depression spread rapidly around the world. Widespread unemployment affected almost every country, and the national economy and trade declined sharply. Traditional liberalism was called into question, and there was talk of a deep crisis of capitalism. The shock was very serious for the capitalist system because in those same years the whole world witnessed the first steps of a collectivist economy taking hold in the Soviet Union. Between 1929 and 1932, the world experienced one of the worst depressions in history. The existing state of economic science was powerless to solve the problem, and the decisions taken by governments were, on the whole, misguided. Policies tended to be protectionist in nature, designed to insulate national economies from external contagion. Attempts at international cooperation failed at the London Conference of 1933. Each country avoided external contamination and sought to export its unemployment through protectionist policies. A case in point is the United States, which imposed very high tariffs. At this juncture, the Depression spread very quickly, mainly because of the sheer scale of the U.S. economy compared to the rest of the world. In 1929, 40% of world manufacturing production was located in the United States. Its imports represented 12% of the world total, while its exports accounted for 15.8% globally. The improvement in 1933 had little to do with government recovery programs, although some instigated ambitious plans to boost their economies. The recovery was very slow and uneven, especially in terms of job creation, to the extent that on the eve of the Second World War there were still a number of countries with very impoverished economies. This precarious situation led to rearmament policies that reactivated the arms industry, a major consumer of industrial raw materials. These actions were not only a danger to world peace, but also a fertile breeding ground for fascism. Peace and economic instability in the 1920s. Throughout the 19th century, the European continent experienced significant economic development. Economic growth rates were modest and very uneven across countries, but were particularly strong in Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. However, the War of 1914 to 1918 was the dramatic precedent for the Second World War and led to significant stagnation. For all those who witnessed the high number of casualties or the levels of destruction caused by this event, it was such a shock that it was referred to as the Great War. Once peace was achieved, far from alleviating economic problems, it arguably increased them for 2 main reasons. Firstly, because it led to increasing financial and monetary instability, and secondly, because it stimulated a certain economic nationalism. The best known of the treaties was that of Versailles, which established peace with Germany. Apart from territorial compensation for regions such as Alsace and Lorraine, the treaty allowed France to occupy the Saar Valley coal basin for 15 years and ceded parts of Prussia and part of Upper Silesia, rich in mineral deposits, to Poland. But the most significant aspects, apart from border adjustments, centered on dispossessing Germany of much of its mineral resources, iron, zinc, coal, depriving it of 13% of its arable land, as well as its colonies in Africa and the Pacific. The 1929 crisis and its effects on the world economy. Until 1929, none of the economic crises in previous history had been as far-reaching as the one that occurred in that year. Above all, the crash of 1929 is significant for its broad global impact, which was facilitated by the importance of the United States in the international economy. The exceptions were nations that, because of their precariousness or economic situation, were cut off from the capitalist system. In any case, the crisis did not begin at the same time in all countries, nor did it have the same magnitude, nor was its duration identical. The unfolding of the 1929 crisis has been well described by many scholars, but the analysis of the causes remains a matter of discussion and debate. First, there is the instability school, which characterizes capitalism as an essentially unstable system. Second, the stability school assumes that the market is able to cope with the different crises that the system undergoes and is capable of returning to equilibrium. Neoclassical economists are part of this group and have not been very interested in the analysis of cycles. The causes of the 1929 crash: the United States emerged from the First World War in a favored position, or at least in a stronger position, than in 1914. In economic terms, it had shifted from being a debtor to a creditor and had expanded its sphere of influence in international markets, while Europe was very slowly trying to recover. The balance of trade was extremely favorable. The population was growing markedly. Technological advances were very substantial, and the many markets were yielding to the momentum of American exports. However, serious economic problems, some of them of a structural nature, inherited from the 19th century, had been identified for years before the outbreak of the crisis. For example, there was a lack of interest in reinvesting in industrial activities, which led to an imbalance in this sector and an unfavorable trend in agricultural prices. Between 1920 and 1921, the country suffered an acute and brief economic crisis, which was reflected in the harsh living conditions of a large part of the population. Despite the difficulties, recovery was noticeable in the following years. The gap left by industrial investment was filled by channeling substantial amounts into speculation on the New York Stock Exchange. This speculative fever was evident throughout the 1920s. In these years, it experienced a spectacular rise that at times provoked an atmosphere of unbridled speculation and closed one of the most extraordinary speculative periods. The share price index rose from 100 in 1926 to 216 in 1929. Until March 1928, the rise in share prices was not excessive and remained in line with profits. From then on, a speculative boom phase ensued. Some businessmen painted a glowing picture and heralded a period of economic upswing and enormous profits. On the 12th of June 1928, there was a first warning with the sale of more than 5 million shares and an overall loss of 23 points in the value of the shares. From July onwards, the stock market experienced further rises, and the election campaign for the U.S. presidency focused on announcements of prosperity and welfare. During the summer of that year, American banks and investors began to restrict purchases of German and other bonds. The aim was to invest their funds through the New York Stock Exchange, which began to soar. After the election of Republican candidate Herbert Hoover, the stock market experienced a further rise. In his memoirs, Hoover 1952-2016, recalling these fateful years, he called speculation a crime worse than murder and one for which men should be reviled and punished. The rise in the stock market did not correspond to increased productivity, but was rather the result of an excessive process of speculation by not only large corporations, but also small and medium-sized investors. The investment fever stemmed from an exaggerated eagerness to achieve capital growth and was not based on the attraction that good dividends from a profitable company could offer. Thus, a spiral of acquisitions was unleashed, leading to a permanent upward spiral. In these months of speculative rises, many people of modest means rushed to buy stocks by borrowing money. New York banks were lending short-term at 12% interest when they were borrowing from the Federal Reserve at 5%. But speculation was doomed to failure if stock prices did not correlate with production and profits. And it was indeed the United States that was beginning to experience a certain degree of stagnation and regression. The U.S. gross national product began to decline gradually and steadily in the early months of 1929. A sector as dynamic and expanding as automobile manufacturing began to falter. In March, production reached 622,000 vehicles, while 6 months later it was down to 416,000. In other words, production in this key industry fell by almost 40%. For its part, Europe, at the end of the summer of 1929, was beginning to feel the decline in American investment abroad. Even Germany, the second epicenter of the conflict, was already in serious difficulties by the end of 1928. The economies of many countries deteriorated alarmingly until 1933, with a particular contraction of international trade and the industrial sector. The bomb had been primed. All that remained was for it to detonate. From the chairman of the Federal Reserve to prestigious economists at Harvard University, they spoke of the excellent health of American industry and the irrelevance of brokers' loans. At the same time, they argued that nothing could stop stock prices from rising and showed that the position of the markets is satisfactory and that the value of stocks has a healthy base given the prosperity of the United States. For these learned economists, stock prices had reached a permanent value. In the United States in the preceding months, a decline in investment, production, and income had begun to be detected. At the same time, prices were falling. The break on the situation occurred in October 1929, but despite its brutality, it came in stages. The crisis manifested itself on the 24th of October, Black Thursday, when nearly 13 million securities were offered with almost no demand. The banks intervened in order to halt the fall and briefly managed to restore confidence. By the end of Black Thursday, share prices had fallen by between 12 and 25 points. On Monday, the 28th of October, the collapse began without any possibility of rescue. On that day, a total of 9,250,000 shares went on sale. Industrial assets were down 49 points, and bankers were unwilling to buy any more securities. On the 29th of October, Black Tuesday, the panic triggered a new spate of stock market sell-offs, 33 million shares, causing a terrible fall in the value of shares. The Dow Jones Index of the New York Stock Exchange between September 1929 and January 1933 shows that the values of 30 companies fell from an average of $364.90 to $62.70 per share. The 20 government debt securities dropped from $141.90 to $28, and the stock prices of 20 railway companies declined from $180 to $28.10. Despite the catastrophe, a few days after these events, voices were still being heard, claiming that the present stock market and business recession is not a precursor sign of a depression, or that it was unlikely that there would be a repetition of a situation as serious as that of 1,921,921, and even that the recovery will take place in the spring of 1930 and consolidate in the autumn. The absence of perspective suggested that the industry was on the road to recovery. These statements show the lack of awareness of the seriousness of the problem among both political leaders and the brainy economists of the time, as well as the inability to find appropriate solutions to emerge from the crisis. The stock market crash was not the cause of the Great Depression, but it was the starting pistol that signaled the race towards declining output and rising unemployment. The fragmentation of the banking structure was one of the weaknesses of the U.S. economy. Not only was easy access to credit a problem, but also the mistakes made by the authorities in monetary policy, especially the actions of the Federal Reserve, which was described as a body of startling incompetence. After many decades and numerous studies on the subject, there is no unanimity as to the most determinate causes of the Depression. For some, they were mainly monetarist. For others, they lay in the fall in consumption and investment and how this spread throughout the economy. One of the reasons most often used to explain the collapse of the New York Stock Exchange is the exorbitant rise in stock prices. It has already been said that the boom in securities could not last indefinitely. Speculation decoupled from economic activity, that is, from production and profits, brings its own ruin. The lessons of speculation are recurrent, It had already occurred in 18th century England and 19th century France and provide clear evidence of its harmful aspects. One might then ask about the reasons that led to the long and enormous speculation of the years 1927 to 1929. It was the result of monetary inflation caused by the policy of cheap money and easy credit granted by the Federal Reserve. This conduct was one of the most serious mistakes made by any banking organization in the last century. U.S. authorities were overwhelmed by the pace and momentum of events. The speed of the circulation of money and the expectations of speculators swept away everything in their path. The impact of the crisis in Europe in terms of structural factors. What stands out is the growing importance of the U.S. economy in the rest of the world, which facilitated the rapid expansion of the Depression. The stoppage of capital exports affected a number of countries, especially Germany, as well as the nations of Central and South America, which, seeing their financing channels interrupted, stopped buying U.S. products. The process was completed when the United States reduced its purchases of raw materials from these countries, causing prices to fall dramatically. This paralysis of international trade was compounded by the changes taking place in industry as a result of the second phase of industrialization. Traditional sectors, textiles and coal, gave way to new ones, chemicals and capital goods. The adjustment of monetary policy by the United States led to the almost immediate bankruptcy of more than 5,000 banks, 5,096 between 1929 and 1932, and was so far-reaching that it paralyzed investment. Between 1929 and 1933, of the 26,000 existing American banks, some 11,000 closed their doors. This led to a strong deflationary process. The fragmented structure of the U.S. banking system was one of the first causes of the chain of bank failures. Most banks were small, operating in very limited areas. The economic conditions of the region where they were located determined the success or failure of their management. France was the only European country to escape the financial crisis. Its large gold reserves, about 25% of the world's stock, allowed it to withstand the crisis without too much stress. Its main problem was not to lose too much value as it disposed of its sterling reserves, which were heavily devalued. However, economic recovery took many years. Depression, spread, and solutions. The depression following the crisis of 1929 was very intense. It manifested itself in all its severity until 1932, and its repercussions spanned the entire globe. The decline in economic activity in the United States had very serious repercussions. Industrial production halved, and capital goods production fell by 75%. Private investment remained very weak throughout most of the decade, and in 1937 was still 30% below its 1929 value. The financial difficulties of farmers who were unable to repay their loans, together with the fall in agricultural prices, led to the bankruptcy of a significant number of small banks. This negative trend in prices had been going on since 1919, worsened from 1925 onwards, and became critical after 1929 with a fall of 55%. However, the cost of living, which fell by 33%, did not keep pace with prices, so the situation of small farmers became increasingly burdensome. Agricultural production did not decline during the Depression, but prices indicate the drop in domestic and foreign demand. Unemployment became one of the clearest manifestations of the crisis. In October 1929, the number of unemployed in the United States was around 5 million, and 1 year later it was close to 8 million. By the end of 1932, the figure had reached 12 million, and in 1933 the total was over 13 million. The unemployment rate was 27% of the working population of 48 million. International initiatives to alleviate the crisis were few and, to a large extent, misguided. These included the creation of the Bank for International Settlements in Zurich on the 20th of January 1930. Its main task was to oversee the payment of war reparations. The Swiss bank became a meeting place for central bankers, where international loans could be arranged. It played a key role in the training of economists with international skills, who joined the international organizations set up after 1945. It also excelled as a center for the production of plans for the reorganization of the international economic system. Most countries dealt with the crisis by defending the domestic market and restricting imports. In July 1931, in an attempt to alleviate the effects of the Depression, exchange controls were introduced, a protectionist measure intended to stem the flight of capital. Attempts at international cooperation were rather limited, as most countries sought to increase their exports and limit their imports as much as possible. In effect, they had shifted into the practice of 17th-century mercantilism. The United States and the New Deal. As mentioned earlier, attempts were made at international action to put the crisis to rest. However, reality revealed the deep connections between economic and political life, as well as the mistrust existing between some states. As a consequence of both, it proved difficult to find solutions that would please or suit all governments. Reactions to the crisis varied. In the case of the United States, a series of measures known as the New Deal were adopted, championed by then-President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In order to deal decisively with this accumulation of difficulties, he developed an administration that applied a decidedly interventionist economic policy with the aim of combating the effects of the Great Depression. This program was deployed between 1933 and 1938 with the aim of stimulating consumption and investment, reforming financial markets, and helping the poorest segments of the population. In June 1933, one of the most characteristic measures of the intervention program was implemented, the National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, which brought together a series of regulations that were very advanced for the time. Its main objective was to revive the economy by preventing overproduction and developing codes of free competition. In addition to guaranteeing decent living wages, it aimed to ensure that companies made reasonable profits and, above all, that they respected the rules of competition, good business practices, and the elimination of piracy or dishonest behavior. The government sought to raise prices, reduce working hours, and increase wages. The economic policy represented by the New Deal has been widely criticized. At first glance, what was achieved between 1933 and 1939 was not very significant. Unemployment remained high, and investment did not recover to 1928 levels. Private investment was low, and public spending was not able to cope with the needs of such a large country. The depth of the Depression was severe, and a policy based on budget deficits was not sufficient to overcome such a difficult situation. But a closer look shows that the measures taken helped to increase aggregate demand and slow its decline. In the absence of public spending, the Depression would have been even more intense. A final assessment. Between 1929 and 1939, the European economy was very uneven and varied from country to country. Until the rearmament at the end of the decade, the policies adopted by governments were driven by domestic mechanisms and did not take into account a global perspective. The United States sought a solution to its problems through the New Deal, which led to a renewal of American policy and institutions, although it did not have a decisive impact on economic recovery. The countries that made the greatest economic progress in this decade were Germany and Japan. The former because its productive recovery was based on high public spending, for example on motorway construction, and the latter because the crisis was very contained and the subsequent upturn very solid. Great Britain was at an intermediate level, with a rapid recovery, although without reaching the level of Japan and Germany. France and the United States were the worst performers, the U.S. because it suffered a very severe crisis, and France because it developed ineffective recovery policies. And that brings us to the end of our journey through one of the darkest chapters in modern economic history, the Great Depression of 1929, a time when economies collapsed, banks failed, and millions of lives were forever changed. But beyond the statistics and the hardship, this period reshaped the world. It led to new economic policies, stronger financial regulations, and a deeper understanding of how fragile and interconnected global economies can be. The lessons of the Great Depression still echo today, reminding us of the importance of stability, resilience, and preparedness in the face of uncertainty. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more deep dives into history's most defining moments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.